They said Eli Walker left with a heart made of iron and hands stained by the road he never should have taken. But no one knew the truth, that love once softened that iron, and the woman who held it in her palms was Clara James. Her name still echoed between the wind and the canyon walls. Like a hymn the desert refused to forget. Clara didn't chase him when he rode away. She just kept the porch light burning. Night after night, its glow trembling against the dark, the flame flickering like her hope, small, stubborn, and alive. No one in town believed Eli would ever come back. But Clara did, because love out here didn't need proof. It just needed a pulse. The morning sun spilled gold across the wide plains, painting the horizon with the color of promises no one kept. Clara stood at the fence line, fingers brushing over the worn cedar rails, her eyes reaching farther than the road itself. Her white dress was plain, but the way it moved with the wind made her look like a ghost caught between memory and mourning. 3 years had passed since Eli Walker rode away, 3 long years since the dust rose behind his horse and swallowed him whole. Folks said he went chasing down a man who wronged his kin, but Clara knew better. She saw it in Eli's eyes before he left, that it wasn't anger driving him, it was pain. Pain had a way of pretending to be purpose when the heart didn't know where else to go. Life in the valley didn't wait. The saloon still lit up every night. The same piano cried the same tired tunes, and the preacher's voice still cracked over the same verses each Sunday. But for Clara, time didn't move in days. It moved in memories. Every sigh of wind that tangled her hair carried Eli's name. Every star that fell made her wonder if he'd seen the same one wherever he was. Sometimes she'd sit by the window, the oil lamp low, her fingertips tracing the initials carved into the wooden frame. E.W. The carving had faded, but her faith hadn't. Folks called her foolish, said she was wasting her youth on a man lost to the trail. But Clara just smiled, that soft, knowing smile of hers, the kind born from patience and prayer. Hope was all she had left to give. The old mare, Daisy, snorted behind her, shaking her mane, breaking Clara's reverie. She turned, brushing her hand along the mare's neck, whispering to her in the same tender rhythm she once used with Eli. It wasn't words so much as feeling, a quiet plea for the wind to carry her love wherever he rode. That night, a storm came crawling from the west, heavy and restless. Rain beat against the shutters, thunder growled low across the land, and Clara lay awake, her heart matching the rhythm of the sky. Somewhere in the storm's voice she thought she heard hooves, faint, distant, swallowed by the dark. When morning broke, the world smelled of wet earth and wild grass. The storm had washed the dust clean, but the mud told its own stories. Clara stepped out to the porch, her boots sinking slightly, her gaze fixed on the open trail beyond the gate. And there, pressed into the damp soil, was a single horseshoe print. It wasn't new, but it wasn't old either, and for the first time in 3 years, the ache of waiting didn't sting so sharply. It felt like breathing again. Miles away, beneath a sky still bruised from rain, Eli Walker slowed his horse near a nameless river. His hands trembled as he touched the small locket tied to his saddle horn, Clara's picture still safe inside. He'd left to bury his pain, but every road he took curved back to her memory. Some men ride to forget. Others ride because love is the only thing that remembers them. Eli was both. And somewhere between thunder and silence, fate began stitching the distance between them, one heartbeat at a time. The season changed slow that year. Summer didn't blaze through like it used to. It drifted in soft and warm, the kind that whispered of peace instead of fire. The wheat fields swayed gentle under the sun, and the river beyond the ridge finally ran clear again, as if time itself had washed something clean. Clara James felt it too, that subtle easing in the air. The ache that used to sit behind her ribs had turned quiet, almost kind. She spent her mornings tending the small garden behind the house, humming old songs her mother once sang, songs that sounded like prayers for the tired heart. Every now and then, her gaze would wander to the horizon, but it no longer hurt to look that far. The horses had grown restless with the change of season, and Clara found comfort in their rhythm. She'd brush them slow, her hands steady, her mind floating somewhere between yesterday and someday. When she worked, the world made sense, her body busy, her heart still. Sometimes, though, at sunset, the silence would grow too deep. That's when she'd take the locket from the wooden box under her bed. Inside it was a small sketch Eli made of her the night before he left. Nothing more than pencil lines and memory, but to Clara, it was worth more than gold. The edges were worn, smudged with years of touch, but the eyes he drew still carried warmth. She'd hold it close, whispering softly into the dusk, "You'll find your way back." Out on the road, Eli Walker was learning how time humbles a man. He'd been to places that didn't remember his name, worked hands raw on ranches that weren't his own, traded silence for sleep and sleep for silence again. But through it all, Clara's face stayed with him, clear as morning light over the plains. Every night, when the fire burned low, he'd take that same locket from his saddle horn and stare at her picture until dawn began to crawl back across the sky. There was guilt in his eyes now, not for leaving but for the years lost. One evening, while crossing through a small town on the edge of the territory, Eli heard a tune playing in the saloon, soft and haunting, the same melody Clara used to hum while hanging laundry in the warm wind. He froze in the doorway, the sound wrapping around him like memory. It hit him then. No matter how far he rode, he hadn't escaped her. He'd only circled closer to her heart. He left town before sunrise. The road called him home before he even realized he was answering it. Back in the valley, Clara felt the shift long before anyone spoke of it. Maybe it was the wind, maybe something older, something in her bones. The air carried a strange sweetness that day, the kind that tasted like change at the general store. Folks spoke of a lone rider heading east, a man with a weathered coat and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much. Clara didn't ask questions, but her pulse fluttered quietly, a secret her body couldn't keep. That night she sat on the porch again. The lantern light danced across her face, and for a moment she imagined she saw movement on the far ridge, just a blur of motion against the fading blue. She blinked and it was gone, but her heart didn't slow down after that. When the moon rose, Clara walked down to the river. The water was still and silver, reflecting the stars like a mirror of lost wishes. She dipped her fingers in, feeling the chill whispering to the night, "You promised you'd find me again." Miles away, beneath that same moon, Eli stopped his horse near a line of willows. The air smelled of rain and wildflowers, the kind that only grew near the valley he once called home. He lifted his head, eyes tracing the familiar shape of the distant mountains. A faint light flickered there, small, golden, waiting. He exhaled slowly, his voice rough from the road. "I'm almost there, Clara." The stars above him didn't answer. They didn't need to. The road already had. That night, the wind carried her name through the canyons, low and steady, the same way she whispered his every evening before sleep. Somewhere between her prayers and his weary breath, something began to align. Because love, real love, doesn't fade in distance. It simply waits for the wind to bring it home. The valley hadn't changed much in 3 years, at least not to the eyes of anyone passing through. But to Eli Walker, it felt like a place reborn. The grass seemed greener, the wind gentler, the hills softer in the morning light. He slowed his horse at the ridge and looked down at the stretch of land he once called home. And for the first time since he'd left, he let himself breathe. He had imagined this moment 1,000 different ways on the road, every version both better and worse than the last. But the real thing wasn't grand. It was quiet, and that quiet broke something open inside him. He took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair, staring down at the small house tucked near the river bend. The same porch, the same fence line, the same soft smoke curling from the chimney. Only one thing had changed, a new patch of white flowers blooming near the steps. He remembered planting their seeds in his last spring there, the same day Clara James had braided wildflowers into her hair and told him that love, if it was true, would outlast the rain. He'd laughed then, not because he didn't believe her, but because he was afraid he did. Now he saw those flowers again, tall and alive, and he felt their meaning cut straight through the miles that had hardened him. Down in the valley, Clara was feeding the chickens when the air shifted. It wasn't a sound or a sight, just something deep in her chest, like a whisper brushing against her heartbeat. She looked up toward the ridge without knowing why. The horizon shimmered in the heat, the kind of mirage that tricks lonely hearts into seeing what they want to see. She told herself it was nothing, but her hands trembled anyway. That night she couldn't sleep. The wind carried the smell of sage and rain, the same scent she remembered from the night Eli left. She lay awake listening, not for thunder, not for rain, but for hooves. It had become a kind of ritual, her nightly vigil to the silence. But this time the silence wasn't empty. It pulsed, alive and waiting. Far from the house, hidden by the shadows of cottonwoods, Eli watched the soft glow of the lantern through her window. His heart pounded hard against his chest, not from fear, but from something heavier, the weight of love that had never died. He wanted to ride straight to her door, to call her name the way he used to fall to his knees and tell her every regret he'd buried in the dust. But he didn't, not yet, because what if the light in that window didn't belong to waiting anymore? What if someone else had stayed while he was gone? The thought hit him like a cold blade, but Eli didn't move. He stayed there, silent, letting the night decide what kind of man he'd become. At dawn, Clara rose early, her hair still tangled from sleep. She poured herself coffee and stepped outside to the porch, the mist curling around her feet. The horses were restless again, turning their heads toward the ridge. Daisy, the oldest mare, pawed the dirt and gave a low whinny. "Easy, girl," Clara murmured, but her voice trembled. She followed the horse's gaze and saw it then, a dark figure on the ridge, still and watchful. The sun caught on the metal of a saddle buckle, flashing once, bright as a signal. Her breath caught in her throat. It couldn't be, but her heart already knew. Eli Walker didn't move for a long while. He just watched as Clara stepped toward the fence, one hand lifting to shield her eyes from the sun. Even at that distance, he could see her face clearly, the same softness, the same quiet fire. He'd carried that image for years, and now here it was, breathing before him. He wanted to call her name, but no sound came out. The weight of 3 years sat heavy in his chest, so he did what he always did when words failed. He took off his hat and pressed it to his heart. Clara's lips parted, her eyes wide. The world stilled around her, then she blinked, and he was gone, just like that. The ridge was empty again. She stood there for what felt like forever, her pulse drumming in her ears, trying to decide if she'd truly seen him or if the loneliness had finally turned to ghosts. But deep down, she knew ghosts didn't bow their heads like that. That evening, she lit the porch lantern again, brighter than she ever had before. If he was out there, if he was real, he'd see it. And he did. From the dark of the trees, Eli watched the flame flicker to life. It glowed steady, golden, stubborn. He smiled just a little. That light had been waiting for him all along, a beacon of all the things he thought he'd lost. He whispered her name into the quiet. Clara. The word carried, soft but sure, across the valley. And though she couldn't hear it, she felt it, like the wind had said something familiar. That night, neither of them slept. The distance between them had thinned to nothing but time, and time at last was ready to give up. By dawn, Eli Walker saddled his horse again and turned down the slope toward home. And inside the house by the river, Clara James smoothed her dress and brushed her hair as if her hands already knew what the day would bring. Because love, when it's true, always finds the courage to return. The morning broke soft and pale, the kind of dawn that came with the promise of change. Mist rose from the river, curling low across the valley, wrapping the world in silver. The air was still, too still, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Clara James stood by the window, hands wrapped around a mug gone cold long ago. She hadn't slept. The lantern still burned low on the table, its wick dancing weakly against the soft light of morning. The horses stirred restlessly in the corral, their hooves shifting in the dirt. Even the wind seemed to whisper something new. And then she heard it. Faint at first, the steady rhythm of hooves, slow and sure, echoing down the trail from the ridge. Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't move, didn't even blink, afraid that if she did, the sound would disappear. But it didn't. It grew stronger, closer, real. Eli Walker rode down the slope as the sun began to spill over the valley, painting him in gold and dust. His hat hung low, his coat worn from miles of silence. But when he reached the fence line and looked up toward the porch, he felt the world stop moving. Clara was there, standing barefoot in the doorway, the morning light catching in her hair. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Time stood still, letting them look at each other like it was the first time and the last all at once. Eli dismounted slowly, boots sinking into the soft earth. Every step toward her felt heavier than the one before, carrying the weight of 3 lost years. When he stopped at the fence, he took off his hat and looked up at her. His voice came low, rough from years of dust and silence. "Didn't think I'd still be welcome here." The words hung between them, fragile, trembling. Clara's eyes softened. She stepped down from the porch, her hands clutching her skirt, her voice barely more than a breath. "I never stopped waiting." Something broke in him then. Quiet, deep, necessary. Eli closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he let himself feel the weight of love instead of the burden of distance. He opened the gate, the hinges creaking like old ghosts, and walked toward her. The scent of her, lavender and river wind, hit him like memory. He stopped just a breath away. "You look the same," he said softly. "And you look like every mile between us," she answered, a faint smile pulling at her lips. For a moment, they both laughed, small, shaky, but real. Then the silence returned, full of everything they didn't say. Eli lifted a hand, stopping halfway, unsure if he had the right to touch her anymore. But Clara closed the distance herself, pressing her palm against his cheek, her thumb brushing the rough edge of his jaw. "I thought I'd forgotten your face," she whispered, "but I couldn't forget your eyes." Eli leaned into her touch, his voice breaking. "I thought I'd lost you." "You didn't," Clara said. "You just got lost yourself." The words struck deep, gentle, forgiving, true. He pulled her closer, arms trembling, holding her as if the years between them could dissolve right there in the morning light. The world around them faded, the fields, the birds, even the wind, until there was nothing left but the sound of 2 hearts remembering how to beat in rhythm again. When Eli finally spoke, his voice was thick. "I tried to let go, Clara, but every road led me back here. And I waited," she said simply, "because I knew you'd find the way." They stayed like that for a long time, the quiet of the valley wrapping around them. Later, they sat on the porch steps, side by side, watching the sun climb higher. Eli told her pieces of his journey, not the dark parts, just enough for her to understand how far he'd fallen, and how much she'd kept him alive. He spoke of lonely nights by dying campfires, of strangers' kindness, of how he'd carry her locket through every storm. And Clara, listening with her head against his shoulder, realized she didn't need to know everything. It was enough that he'd come back, not broken, just changed. When the wind shifted, she smiled and said softly, "You can rest now. Eli, you don't have to run anymore." He turned to her, eyes glinting with the kind of peace he hadn't known in years. "I'm home, Clara, that's all I ever wanted." The day stretched golden and slow. The world, for the first time in forever, felt right. But as the sun began to sink behind the ridge, a question hung between them, unspoken, gentle, waiting. Was love strong enough to heal the years they'd lost? The answer wasn't in words. It was in the way Eli's hand found hers again, quiet, certain, steady. It was in the light that flickered in Clara's eyes, in the way the wind wrapped around them like a promise renewed. Love didn't erase the past. It simply learned to grow around it. And as twilight fell over the valley, Eli Walker finally let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, the road had always been leading him back here, to her. The days that followed moved like honey. slow, golden, and soft. The valley seemed to breathe easier, as though the earth itself had been waiting for Eli Walker to come home. The mornings began with sunlight spilling across the worn porch, where he and Clara James sat side by side. And the nights ended with lantern light flickering gently against the walls, their shadows moving together as if they'd never been apart. Eli had changed, not in the way time hardens a man, but in the way it humbles him. His voice had quieted. His eyes, once sharp with pride, had turned softer, steady, watchful, grateful. He still carried the marks of the miles he'd ridden, but now those miles felt like they belonged to something, to someone. Clara didn't ask for stories anymore. She didn't need to know where he'd been or what ghosts had followed him. She only cared about where he was now, here at her table in her garden, his laughter mixing with hers in the open air. In the evenings, she'd stand by the river and watch the sun melt behind the ridge, the water glowing amber. Sometimes Eli would join her, his arm resting lightly around her shoulders, their silence saying more than words ever could. It wasn't a perfect peace. Some nights the past still crept in, the kind of ache that memory never fully lets go of. Eli would wake from dreams that smelled of gunpowder and dust, his breath unsteady. Clara would stir beside him, her hand finding his, her voice barely a whisper. "You're home," she'd remind him. "You're safe." And each time, he'd exhale like a man setting down the last weight he'd ever carry. There was one morning when Eli saddled his horse before dawn. The sky was still ink dark, and the mist clung low over the field. Clara stepped out onto the porch, her shawl pulled tight, her heart thudding with the old fear that he was leaving again. But Eli looked up at her, and the smile on his face broke that fear clean in half. "I'm not going far," he said softly. "Just up to the ridge. Haven't watched the sunrise from there in a long time." She nodded, but he saw the shimmer in her eyes. When the first light touched the valley, Clara followed the trail he'd taken. The dew soaked her hem, and the air smelled of sage and rain. When she reached the top, Eli was there, sitting with his hat in his hands, the dawn spilling fire and gold over his face. He didn't turn when she came near. He didn't have to. "Do you remember," she said quietly, "what you told me before you left?" He thought for a moment, eyes tracing the edge of the horizon. "That I'd come back when the road stopped running." She smiled. "And did it?" He nodded slowly. "It stopped the moment I saw the light in your window again." For a while they said nothing more. The wind moved gently through the grass, the world below them still waking. Then Clara reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. "Eli," she whispered, "we lost so much time." He squeezed her hand, his voice steady. "We still have what's left, and I'll spend every bit of it loving you." Tears filled her eyes, but they weren't sad. They were the kind that come when the heart finally feels safe again. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and the two of them watched the sun climb, slow and certain, across the endless western sky. As the day warmed, they rode down together, past the wildflowers he once planted, past the fence he'd built with his own hands, past the porch where she'd waited every night for 3 long years. The light hit the house just right, making it glow like something sacred. That evening, they lit the lantern once more. Only this time, it wasn't for waiting, it was for remembering. For every lonely night that had led them back here, to this peace, to this love that had survived the wind, the silence, and the road. And when the stars came out, Eli Walker looked up at them and whispered, almost to himself, "You can rest now, Clara. The road finally ends here." Clara James smiled, her hand finding his again. "No, Eli, it doesn't end. It just finally found where it belongs." The wind sighed through the valley, carrying their laughter, their quiet, their love. 2 hearts stitched back together beneath the wide western sky. And from then on, every night that light burned in the window, not as a beacon for the lost, but as proof that sometimes love does come home.